Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final of 4 events here from the Minnesota Historical Society discussing shared spaces and public places. I'm Tom Weber, and we're discussing case studies both here in Minnesota and nationally of places and spaces that have been renamed or reclaimed. We're gathering online in our homes and offices, but I suspect most of us are joining from the ancestral homeland of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. And today we're wrapping up things with a conversation about renaming Henry Sibley High School, which is in Mendota Heights, Minnesota. We're going to dive more into the story and the legacy of Sibley in this conversation as well. The Minnesota Historical Society believes in cultivating curiosity and guiding inquiry to foster a more empathetic, inclusive, reflective, and informed community. The goal today is to provide space for critical reflection on the way history intersects with contemporary issues and concerns. The people you hear from are working to expand our understanding of the past and also using it to guide thinking about conditions of the present in order to shape a more inclusive future. This is also a chance to dive deeper into the legacy of one of the people at the center of some of these conversations about renaming. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on my first two guests who just frankly know a lot about Henry Sibley, and that's where we're going to start. Dr. Annette Atkins is an author and retired faculty at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict. She has written several books, one of which is called, I should say, Creating Minnesota, A History from the Inside Out. Hello, Annette. Thank you for being here. And Kevin Maijala is Director of Learning Initiatives at the Minnesota Historical Society as well. Kevin, hello.
Thank you.
So, this actually isn't, we're going to do something a little different than we've done in the first 3 events, very slightly different. Don't expect major changes. But in the previous 3 events, we have focused more on the process that people went through to change a name so that other people who are watching this, who might be in a situation where they are about considering changing a name, can get some tips and things like that. But I actually want to take some time to dive into the actual topic. So Annette, start us off. Who was Henry Sibley?
So Henry Sibley is a really interesting, complicated, difficult man, I think, to come to terms with. I've come to think about him as sort of part 1 and part 2, Henry Sibley 1 and Henry Sibley 2. Sibley is born in Detroit in 1811, though of course it would have been called Detroit when he was born there because it was such an important French-speaking place. And so he would have grown up speaking both English and French. And just by the by, an interesting little fact about him to me is that he is the second Henry Sibley in his family. His older brother is Henry Sibley, who dies in infanthood, and his parents named their second son also Henry Sibley. And I've had occasion to wonder what it means to carry around that memory and that responsibility. And that's a kind of information that I like to include when I'm thinking about historical characters, because the temptation is so much to deny them the emotional complexity that we allow to ourselves and to each other in the present. So I don't know what that meant for him. I just think there must have been something in that was complicating for him. So when he's offered the chance by the American Fur Company as a really young man, and he's 23 years old, he's already working for the American Fur Company in Detroit, and he's offered a post at Mendota. And he's sort of perfect for that post because he speaks French, because he will be able to communicate in the French-speaking fur trade that he's going to. And I think 2 things. One, I think he is so thrilled to get out of Detroit, and perhaps thrilled to escape his family as well. Right, so he's going a long ways away. And the nature of his continuing relationship with his own family is not entirely clear to me. But so maybe he's running away. Maybe this is just such a great opportunity. And he loves it. And when he gets out here, I think that he thinks of himself on a grand adventure, and the Dakota people and some Ho-Chunk and some Anishinaabe they're a big community, and he is a minor player in that big community. So he's a minority in that majority, and he wants to make friends, and he wants to fit in. Another of the striking facts about him to me is that he writes about these early years near Mendota for national magazines, and he writes under the pen name of Hal, a Dakota. So we see the extent of his identification with the people he's with. And I don't know what that identification is, but I know that he is thinking of himself as much as he can as part of that grand adventure that these Native people represent. All right. And it's in that time that he fathers a child with a Native woman. He goes hunting, he goes fishing. There are people from all of those tribal communities in and out of his house all of the time, his house in Mendota. So he is right. I mean, I'm doing this thing with my hands to sort of suggest how fully engaged he is then. All right. So I think of that as Henry Sibley 1. As whatever this place is then called, as it's soon later to be called Minnesota, I think he begins to identify himself in quite a different way. I think he wants to become more respectable. Right. So, and what he's gone through so far feels very like a man in his 20s doing this big adventure. And then he turns 30. Helen, his daughter with the Native woman, is born when he's 30, but he marries in 1843 when he's 32. So something happens in those 2 years. And the woman he marries, Jane Steele, is the sister to Franklin Steele, one of the big movers and shakers, but not a fur company kind of mover and shaker. So he's a portent of the new world that's coming. And it is 6 years later, but I think he's anticipating that he really needs to change what he's doing if he's going to have a future in this place. And so I think he gradually lets those ties, that affection, that closeness with the Native community go. And in my imagination, in that early period, he's wearing moccasins. But in about 1842, he puts on boots. Right? And with that, he's signaling this change. And I think he wants to prosper in this new community, but he sees the direction that it's going. Even Jane Steele, when she comes, she brings a piano. She brings antimacassars for the furniture, right, to keep the hair oil off the chairs. These sort of signs of civilization. And one of the most striking things that she does is to forbid Sibley from bringing his dog into his house. Right. Now, if you visit the Sibley house later, you'll see that there is not a picture of Sarah Steele in Sibley house. There is a picture of the dog. Right? So I think there is something, again, pretty interesting and complicated going on. But I think we're seeing him at the beginning of a period where, in order to have the future he wants, he has to distance himself from his Native connections, his Native interests, from that adventure story. And so he starts civilizing, I'm going to put in quotation marks, but civilizing in a very 19th century way of making himself less Indian. I mean, he may have just been, of course, he was just playing at being an Indian, but he puts that identity aside and takes on this other one. And I think he thinks if he wants to get elected, he has to become more white. and he becomes very white. And that's, I think we have a slide of him. That's right. This is about 1870. And you can see there is no remnant of that 22-year-old, 25-year-old left in this man. And by 1870, he has completely traded in all of the chips that he had with those people who at one time he called cousin, and they called cousin, but he has abandoned them. And this is 8 years after the U.S.-Dakota War, where he's also played such a significant role. The only moment in that war where I have any sympathy for him is when, and you can take that slide off, it doesn't matter. The only moment that I have sympathy for him is when Ramsey calls on him to deal with the Dakota in the U.S.-Dakota War. And it's like Ramsey knows him well enough to know that he has put him in an impossible position. Now, Sibley can make a decision at that point, but the decision, so he could have decided, no, I'm not going to do that. But instead he decides, yes, I'm going to do this. And I think
and taking care means killing, just going for it.
Yes. Oh, I'm going to lead troops against people who I once so identified with. So he's done it. He's chosen, he's going. And once he does that, it's like the rest of his life is a trajectory toward complete distancing of himself. So that there's that, then there's the trial, so he's gone. And that's really Henry Sibley too. And so I will stop there. Kevin, you may have.
I want to bring Kevin in, and
Sure.
I just also want to note that we're putting some links throughout this conversation as you're watching in the comments, and go to those because there's a lot of primary sources you can find within those links as well. So Kevin, I mean, what Annette was also talking about, and this is really an important time with which we in the present day have also looked at Sibley, frankly, to make judgments and to make decisions. And it really is around the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, which happened out in western Minnesota at the time. What would you add to what Annette was talking about, specifically about that time as well?
Yeah, 1862, and I so appreciate being on camera with Annette, who's taught me so much over the past 20 years on Minnesota history. The story of Sibley really is exactly what she's saying. There's sort of this first part of him that is very much that young adventurer type, trying to forge his path in I think a very loose sort of carefree sort of way of connecting into a community and trying to find his place. And then again, he's trying to find his place in now what is going to be a more civilized area, civilized again, in quotes. And you can't talk about Sibley without recognizing he was involved for a period of about 40 years in nearly every significant political event that happened in the territory of Minnesota, from being a territorial delegate to being the first governor. He, of course, led the troops against the Dakota in particular in the U.S.-Dakota War in 1862, and then again in 1863 on the first punitive expedition. But I think the key for that transition point is his interactions and his role in the treaties of 1851, one of which was negotiated, started out in his warehouse in Mendota and then moved up on the hill. And that is where that sort of transition happens. And it's really hard to understand that 1862 conflict and even Sibley's role without understanding that he made a very conscious choice to protect the interests of the fur trade and the economics over the interests of Dakota. And I think that's one of those points that becomes a really important point of contention about how we remember him, because much of this is about the naming of counties and schools and other things is really about his role as an incredibly important political person who helped form the state. And you can't take that away from him. That's an important piece of it. Now we are re-examining, as historians do, sort of his legacy and how it's affected many different groups.
And just before we go in that, just to give, for those who don't know Henry, just to give just a little bit of a first governor of Minnesota. Yeah. As Minnesota as a state, a delegate to Congress, I believe, when Minnesota was a territory. Is that right?
49 to 53, yeah.
tapped to command troops during the U.S. Dakota War, and then established a military commission in 1862 that sentenced more than 300 Dakota men to death. Of that, 38 were executed. And then, as Kevin just mentioned, after the Dakota War, we kept going. We being the white leadership, the white political leadership of Minnesota, we sent out more expeditions to find and either drive out or just kill Dakota people after that. And he was a part of that as well. And Annette, I know you were going to mention something, but at one point when he was a member of Congress, he actually pushed for the preservation of Indian land from, quote, the grasping hand of the white man. Mm-hmm. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, he was actually advocating for a part of what became southern Minnesota to be a state or some kind of reservation that was basically an all-native enclave where the white man wouldn't go. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, and he was hoping to be the governor of that territory. So think of Oklahoma in sort of a different sense there, and that failed due to partisanship, mainly over slavery and adding territories and states that would have tipped the balance towards that.
And for me, it's hard to think about Sibley apart from his relationship with Ramsey in this second part of his life. Because I think when he goes to Congress, well, I think he believes that he should be the first territorial governor of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And I think he is really unhappy that Ramsey is named in his stead. And Ramsey is brought out from the east, right, and sort of trumps him, and Ramsey continues to trump him throughout much of his career. So the other piece of it is that I think a lot of the Sibley names that got applied in the state to various things were applied while Sibley was still alive. And I think there were people who were trying to make up to him for the fact that Ramsey had gotten so much more prominence than he had and became so much richer and became so much more important. So I felt like these were slightly sort of booby prizes that he was given to placate him, because he lives until 1891. And if you think about how different Minnesota is by 1891, but so there have been sort of 50 years of this Sibley too that he's lived out in the state. And he is involved in the University of Minnesota. He's involved in the Historical Society. He's involved in every important organization in the state and in the formation of the state.
And he was part of writing the Constitution. In fact, if you go to the website for the Sibley Historic Site, which the Historical Society runs, it says on the banner where Minnesota government began. But even that, Kevin, is a moment where we're thinking like, well, was that a good thing? I mean, obviously we are what we are, but that just in and of itself, the concept of Minnesota government having a beginning is in and of itself, we are in a moment of reconsideration.
Well, I think we're always in that moment of reconsideration. I think in particular right now is what we're trying to do is understand the expanded story that maybe has not been fully told previously. You know, I think about that with the U.S. Dakota War a lot. A lot of my early work at the Historical Society was involved in interpreting that, and I also ran the Sibley House for a number of years. That sort of idea of Sibley, to me, also is a person who sort of goes up and down in sort of relationships and those things. And there are absolutely sympathetic moments. And in fact, I think it's important to note during the U.S. Dakota War, he was considered by many in the press to be being soft on the Dakota. And, so again, there's that sort of push to that punishment of what happened. Sibley was absolutely integral to how some of that came out, but then he dropped out after 63 from, even though he loved to be called general later in his life, and it was the elder statesman known as General Sibley. Something caused him to stop, and he used his family as sort of the excuse on that as well. But he, you think about, he was advocating for an Indian territory. He was a part of the fur trade. He fathered this child with a Dakota woman, someone who he honored and St. Paul honored during the time. But later, that story was sort of removed from the historical record. There's the Sibley papers hold no references because those things were destroyed. So again, I think that's part of that civilizing influence that Annette is talking about, of we're going to push all of that in the past. And today, I think one of the roles of history as we look at a person like Sibley is to really truly look back and say, okay, he did all these things. You can call them great, you can call them important, whatever you want to call them. We haven't at all times examined, like, how did that really impact a lot of different people who maybe stories haven't been told as much. That doesn't
including
mean
the Dakota people,
important.
of course.
Yeah, Dakota people specifically in this case. So I think that's the important reexamination that a lot of figures are undergoing in this current environment. And that's, honestly, it's not brand new. It's been happening for decades.
Yeah.
That's been part of
Sure.
historiography. And we're just, at this point, really engaging on people like Sibley and Ramsey here.
We're gonna go to our other guests in just a few minutes, but Kevin, we are bringing this up because there is a high school near where Henry Sibley lived. I didn't get my GPS out. It may actually be the closest high school to that historic site, but it's called Henry Sibley High School. It's in Mendota Heights. And there it is. And as we know, and the end of the story is that the school board last December did decide to take the name off, but you were involved. How, and the Historical Society was involved. How, I believe you went and did a few presentations, to students and faculty and the school board. Do I have that right?
We did present to the school board, and there were a number of other folks who talked with other faculty. And, sort of the focus of that was really, for me, not about that decision to take it off. I was there representing the Historical Society and our partner who runs the site, the Dakota County Historical Society, in sort of the importance of Sibley, and that whatever the decision was, we need to continue to study and understand Sibley in the context of Minnesota formation, of U.S.-Dakota relations, of sort of that impact of those treaties, that war, that exile that Dakota people have experienced. But we need to talk about it in a frame that doesn't leave it all in the past. We have to have the conversation with modern Dakota people today, because often in education over the past 100+ years, that story has often been relegated to the past. And what we're trying to do is talk about the relevance to today and how that impact is continuing. Whatever the decision the school board made, and they made that decision to pull the name, we still have to study and understand this important figure in that context at the time.
Annette, you were going to add?
Yeah, just one last thing, which is what I hope that all of the various discussions we have about naming make us think about is actually the process of naming. And when all of our counties were named, when these important things were named, we lived in a definition of history that said things don't change. So I think ideally I would like every place to be named for like 20 years, and then we sunset the names so that a place could re-up on that name if they wanted, but that it would provoke this kind of conversation. Because what we know now is that the past does not stay fixed in the past. But that's what our naming practices say. But they don't. We know they don't. And there are a whole lot of places whose names I'd like us to have to think about. Some for women reasons, some for immigration reasons.
Well, that's interesting. And Kevin, I'll as we transition to the second part of our conversation, you actually mentioned you did speak to students who noted, I've been going to the school for 3-4 years, and I had never learned anything about Henry. I didn't know who this person was, and it was on my school's name until you came in and gave this 1-hour presentation. So I think that's interesting. It's also interesting, just as a note to what Annette said, when counties, at least in Minnesota, are formed, it's the legislature that names them, which at the time they were naming counties was all white men. And one of the things we've definitely found in this series is that in the efforts to either name or rename something, there have definitely been processes where the community at large is very much involved. It's not just a set of people, speaking from the mountaintop, so to say. So in that spirit, Annette and Kevin, we will hear from you again at the end when we have our Q&A, but I'm going to turn it over now to 2 additional guests. Allicia Waukau-Butler is the American Indian Liaison for School District 197. That's the school district where this school is located, is also Menominee and Navajo. Thank you for being here, Allicia. Hello. And Dr. Kate Beane is Director of Native American Initiatives at the Minnesota Historical Society. Kate, welcome back to this series, and it's great to see you as well.
Good to see you too, Tom.
So, Kate, were you with then Kevin in those presentations, or were you doing anything separately during these conversations about Sibley High?
Yeah, so Kevin and I went together during the pandemic, so it was all online, and we presented to the school board about the legacy of Sibley, who Henry Sibley was, and you know, I work quite a bit with my colleague and friend Kevin, and he gave some really good history. I think I provided some really interesting history and context. And part of what our role there, you know, I was representing the Minnesota Historical Society. Our role wasn't to give an opinion, but at the same time, I, as a Dakota person, work for an institution where Henry Sibley was the president of the institution I work at. And I'm a Dakota person whose family was chased out of Minnesota by Henry Sibley. That is who I am. And as a Dakota person and a Dakota historian who very much knows the impact of this history and how close this history is to our families today, I simply spoke the truth about that history. And so that truth-telling element of how that history impacts us as Dakota people was something that I brought to the conversation.
And Allicia, how did you get involved? Like, you were part of this. I suspect it was interacting a lot with the students. Who came? Was it the students who first came up with the idea? We're hearing a lot of in this series where all of these initiatives start with the students. Is that what happened at Sibley High?
Well, in a roundabout way, I think, you know, I started in this position about 3 years ago. And as soon as I joined on, parents, students were always asking me, how can we get the name changed? How can we do this? And so I think there has always been this continuous dialogue on how can we get this momentum to get the name acknowledged and recognize that it's been harmful to the community here. And so I think there's been a lot of things happening in various pockets. And then I know Bethany Fisher, she really took up a lot within the community as an alumni. And I went out and talked with our American Indian students and families, and also just reiterated that this is a name that's harmful. Many of the parents also that I've talked to have up and coming students that were in elementary school, and they were like, well, we're in the school district, we live here, but I've even already made preparations for my child not to go to Henry Sibley High School because we can't even stand the idea that their diploma would have his name on it, just because it's been such a harmful name to their family.
And so the process was obviously all through the school board, as I mentioned earlier. What was involved there? Kate mentioned this was actually all during the pandemic, so a lot of Zoom meetings. But what was it? Was it getting students in front of the school board? Was it doing community meetings? How did that all happen?
You know, there was a lot of petitions going around that finally garnered, I think, some teeth into the matter. And so the community, the non-Native community, I really felt during this time of, you know, social justice work that's happening, not only because of George Floyd, but other acknowledgments about white privilege and how that's you know, falling around us in this state of Minnesota. We're sort of in the eye of the storm, so to speak. And people, non-Native people, I think really took up this charge and then supported us as the Native people, because we alone didn't have enough support, I don't feel, to really make the change fully. We had to have the backing of the whole community that's in this school district. And that school district is, you know, in the school, I feel like we are very diverse, but in the surrounding area, not so diverse. So, you know, it just took some time. There's a lot of different work, I think, on behalf of like things that happen, like the Historical Society's education and outreach in a variety of ways that really help teachers, the school board and everyone, and that not just recently, but long-term work that the Historical Society and other Native educators who have taken the time to talk about Bdote, what's the significance to the Native people here. And I feel like I'm just the conduit. I don't represent myself as a Dakota person. I feel like I, as a Native person, also an ally, because I'm Navajo and Menominee, which is not Dakota. But I feel like I've tried to gather up my students who are here in the school district. We have roughly about 138 American Indian students in our school district that are just recognized right now. And that number, since I've been working here, has grown from 75. So, and we've always been here, but we're just really recognizing how to change our ethnic coding and have our teachers acknowledge the presence of the students. So that's garnered some momentum. I think the school board has also been really supportive in listening to our position as American Indians in this community. So I feel like they've always had an open ear to hear, and that this was just like ample time to change. So it's a lot of different efforts that have culminated to this moment.
You know, Kate, it occurs to me again, one of the purposes of this series is to offer these recordings of these conversations to people who might be doing something like this in their own community, whether it's watching it live now or later. And it occurs to me there will be people who were in your position, in a position of as a historian, but with an entity who had no job actually saying this is what you should do. We're just here to give you the history. And yet I think about this, the truth you spoke. The truth you spoke, which is a factual statement that you work for an institution that Henry Sibley helped found, that he then pushed all of your ancestors out of the state. That's just a fact. Yet when you say that as a piece of factual truth, it can be perceived as comma, therefore, even though you don't say this, it's comma, therefore you should change it, that you actually do have a position on it. And you might have a position on it personally, but how do you navigate that? I feel like that's like your entire job, is to navigate that, because there is actually a stark truth you're presenting, but it can be perceived as you and the Historical Society taking a position.
Well, and that's something I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think that that's something that is so important to talk about. As Native people, we need to be at the table when decisions are getting made. We need to and are at the table in terms of institutions across the state. We're working at high levels of leadership across the state. And we have to be able to make decisions. We have to be able to advocate for the continuation of truth-telling within the state while being true to who we are as Indigenous people. We can't hide who we are, nor should we want to. You know, the reality of the situation is, according to Sibley, according to the people of that era, I shouldn't be here today. My children shouldn't be here today. And that's the reality that I live with every day, that I work at an institution, that I live in a society where I wasn't expected to survive. And the power of that is that we can respond to it. We're here to respond and say, this is what we've learned. And that's the resilience of what we represent as Indigenous people in this state. We represent that resilience. We represent the heart of this state and the longer history of this state in a way that I think isn't often so well understood. We have the long-held connections to this land within our stories. We have the long-held relationship to the land, to the place names within this place. And our language lives on today, and it's struggling, but we're holding on to it as hard as we can, and we're holding on to who we are as Indigenous people. And Henry Sibley is one of those individuals who was very involved in attempts at assimilation for our people, at attempts of undigenizing us, you know, if that's a word. When you look at his involvement in the 1851 treaties, in particular, his creation of the treaty papers, he personally profited off of our people losing our lands. And personally took those funds that were supposed to go to our people. And we had to live with that. And then later on, he went on to critique us as being dependent when our lands were taken, when the resources were driven far from our families and our children were starving. And yet he called us miserable and dependent creatures at one point. And I think it's important to remember that when we're speaking up as the descendants of these individuals, that, you know, the emotional complexities of our ancestors, their experiences, and the ongoing impacts are what we represent. Our families maybe didn't have a voice at a certain point of time in history because of the power structures that were in play, but we do now. And so we speak up for our ancestors as best as we can.
Allicia, did anyone in researching this ever figure out how the name got on the building to begin with? Does anyone know that?
You know, all that has been told to me was that it was called Sibley originally, and
when it was first built.
When it was first built, this is all it was explained to me. Sibley, but then people would get it confused with Simley, which is a neighboring sort of high school somewhere. So buses would end up at Sibley when they were supposed to be at Simley. And so then they went and named it fully Henry Sibley. But I think it was just, you know, location and that he was, you know, a prominent figure in government and the first, you know, governor and all that. So that's basically it really, they said it really just kind of happened. It wasn't a big vote or choice or, you know, just they had to name it and that this was what it just happened to be.
Well, I mean, that's part of what Annette was talking about too, Kate, about maybe we should have a 20-year term and then decide to re-up it. It was interesting to hear Kevin talk about speaking to students, Kate, who in that 1 hour had learned basically, you know, I was today years old when I learned anything about Henry Sibley, and yet they'd been going to this school for how many years? Why then would there be any connection to the name? If you went through 4 years of Henry Sibley High without actually knowing who that person is, what's the big deal? You know what I'm saying?
Well, and that's where, you know, you have, again, the conversation of nostalgia and heritage versus history and how people hold on to certain things because they can relate to them. And it's something that's passed down in their family. And we all have that. We all have these traditions in different ways. But what we need to understand is how some of these traditions impact other people, how our own traditions impact other people, and how these things that we hold dear are impacting other people in dangerous ways and in detrimental ways. And I think that it's really interesting when we went and talked to the school board, there was that student who came and spoke during, I was almost going to say to the podium, but it was over Zoom. And they came and they spoke and they said, you know, I've learned more about this man than I have in all the years that I've gone to this school. And what's really interesting to me is that there's this notion, there's this idea that when names change, that we're going to forget about people, that we're not going to teach about it, we're not going to talk about it. You know, we saw the same thing happen in other spaces where names have been changed across the city. And in fact, it has the opposite effect. We're talking about them more. We're learning about them more, and we're learning about the complexities of who these individuals are and how these individuals impacted different groups of people in different ways. And I think that that's a really healthy way of looking at history and of interacting with history in a way that's really relatable. And I think the other thing that's really important to realize is that our young people want to relate to history. In order to be invested in history, in order to be change makers, in order to be history makers, they need to be a part of history and they need to feel as though there's a place for them. And for a lot of our children growing up within a society where legacies of white men that either don't represent their families or communities, or in fact harmed their families and communities, are idolized and romanticized, oftentimes they don't feel like they belong. And you see the low graduation rates. You see things that come out of that. Representation is an important conversation to have. We all deserve to feel welcome within our schools, and our kids deserve that.
You know, we were talking, Allicia, in one of our previous events about the Ramsey School in Minneapolis, which was then named for Alan Page, football NFL Hall of Famer, but also a Minnesota Supreme Court justice. And you know, Justice Page is still alive, and before the pandemic was going to the school pretty regularly. So it really occurred to me when I heard that line about the student at Sibley saying I'd never known anything about Henry Sibley. And then I think about all of those students and they're middle school students at Justice Page, where I have a hard time believing any of them, even in 10 years, will ever go through that school without learning who is Justice Page. And it makes me think, because you're in a moment right now where they have decided to remove the name, but they haven't picked a new name. So actually, as we speak, the name is still Henry Sibley High School. You're part of a process, you're part of a committee that is coming up with recommendations. And I just wonder, at some point in the future, there will be a new name picked.
Mm-hmm.
Are you thinking now about how you're going to educate the students for years to come about whoever this person is that you've named the school? Will there be a little day one tutorial when you're a freshman? Whatever it may be. Have people been thinking about that so that you don't get a situation in 50 years where students go through 4 years of that school without knowing who that person is?
Yeah, and that's an interesting topic to bring up because I am on the renaming committee. Our second meeting is actually later tonight. And so I'm really glad and privileged to be on this renaming committee. I think there was over 100 applicants, and we've got about, I think there's a little around 30 who are participating in this renaming committee. And what we're tasked to do is we aren't coming up with a name ourselves, but the community has submitted names through a recommendation link. And that recently closed. And so as the committee, we're tasked to, I think, pick 3 names that we want to recommend to the school board to choose from. And there are certain parameters that the school board has designated for us, is that the name will not be named after an individual. So the school name going forward, what we do know is that it won't be after an individual. And the school mascot will also be continuing for now as the Warriors. So we're tasked with that, and we have a total of 4 meetings. So we have 3 left. And we hopefully will know something by the beginning of this school year of what that new name will be.
So it could be, Maple High School. It could be, I'm thinking of trees for some reason. It's in my brain. It could be, Oak High School, right? Like, so it won't be after someone is what we're going. What it sounds like will be the new name.
Yeah, exactly. I do know that I've heard a lot of different people who said that they've sent in recommendations for specific Dakota words. Even the accurate, and Kate would know more about this, the Mendota word, and some, I think, also recommended Bedote. Just some people who have told me that that's what they've sent in. So we will know further on what those nominations will be. And if there was names, then I guess those ones won't be able to be considered. So I look forward to sort of that fresh start. With a new name. I know our American Indian community is really grateful to our school board for recognizing that this has been a harmful name to us for quite some time, and that we're really looking forward to embracing this school in a better way for our communities to participate.
It is interesting, Kate, to hear Allicia talk, because a lot of the names that we've talked about in this series about renaming, the first series we did was about Bedé-Makaska, which was a reclaiming. You're going back to the original name from Lake Calhoun to Bedé-Makaska. But then you have 3 other examples, well, actually 4, several other examples of building names for people. And then the result is, when they are approved as changes, they change them to another name. They're honoring another person. So it's interesting that in this case, they won't be doing that. I mean, each community can make that decision. But I guess there's part of me that thought maybe there would have been more of that, but it actually seems like there are plenty of communities that just want to change it to another name that honors someone that better reflects the community values. Is that your experience too?
Yeah, I think each of these stories are different and unique and reflect the unique communities in which, where they're at. It's interesting, but Makaska, that work and my involvement in that work was separate from my work at the Minnesota Historical Society. I did that as a private citizen. When I came and talked to Sibley, I was there as a representative of MNHS. And the difference there, as we talked about before, is in what we advocate for and the ability to advocate for something and the ability to talk about what we want to see happen. As a Dakota person, one of the things that I can bring to the table here is some information about the fact that as Dakota people, when we name places, our language is very visual, it's very descriptive. And so like Badote is where the rivers come together. It's also Badote, it's like a soft B. There are different dialects of the language. Both of them are correct. And it's important to know that maybe historically we didn't use names to name spaces. But today we live in this society along with everyone else. And we are in these buildings too. And we have buildings named after our own people that we want to honor within our community. Sitting Bull College, is an example of that. And so we do see more of that now, even though historically we didn't. But I think that all of these things are there to say that these are issues worth talking about. Who are we honoring? Why is it that there's this idea of permanence? That when you put up a structure, when you name something, it has to stay that way forever without understanding that change is going to come. That's the one thing we all know, is that change is inevitable, and being able to be open-minded to that, being flexible to the notion of creating a space for our young people to be able to make their mark sometime down the road.
I just want to mention, we're going to bring back our other two guests as well here for our Q&A. But as we do that, Kate mentioned earlier that she shouldn't be here as a Dakota person. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but after the Dakota War, Congress did pass a law, federal law, that expelled all Dakota and Ho-Chunk people from Minnesota. It's a law that has never been repealed. It still technically exists. So Kate was actually also speaking a truth in that regard as well.
And it has, we've dealt with at the state level. It hasn't been appealed at the federal level. And I think one of the things that I will say is my grandfather, Ohiesa, Charles Eastman, wrote about our family. He wrote on his grandmother's back across a frozen river. He wrote about it in his book, Indian Boyhood. He wrote about our family being chased out of Minnesota by Sibley's army. And that mere fact is something that we just can't deny.
We are going to go now to our questions. So let's bring back Annette and Kevin as well. And we have questions that we can read here at the bottom of the screen for everybody who's watching. So we'll just see if one of those comes up or not. I have actually a question here in the chat if it's not coming up there. No, actually. So what do we have, Ned? I'm talking to our producer here behind the scenes. Do we have one of those questions up? Because it's not showing up on... All right, if we don't have any questions yet, please submit questions in the comment sections. And now that I brought Kevin and Annette back, I just want to get some initial thoughts from you on what we've been talking about with Kate and Allicia. Kevin, did anything strike you that you wanted to add to as well?
Yeah, I think this goes back to that idea of, one of the goals of history is re-examining as we understand more perspectives, we have more evidence. History is additive. Our understanding of history is additive. And part of our job is to make sure as many of those perspectives are brought forth so people can consider them and take them into these conversations about things like renaming or how do we honor particular individuals or events. And I think that's an important part of our process as historians, each generation reinterprets a little bit because they have a slightly different take. I can think back to when I was going to school in the 80s. I didn't learn a lot about the U.S. Dakota War. And say honestly, I had a chance as part of the committee to establish social studies standards in 2011, where we had very specific laws that said that you need to include this content very specifically. And the standards, of course, are a more recent invention in the last 20 years. But we really do need to keep doing this. We need to keep thinking. We need to keep adding these stories and these perspectives so that people build that empathy for each other and understanding that even though we might perceive Sibley differently, we should understand each other's perspectives and move forward from that.
It's interesting to me, Annette, also, this is just a complete side. I grew up in Illinois myself. It's interesting that Henry Sibley, we're talking about him here, but we may have people watching who are not in Minnesota. Henry Sibley is not going to be super well known outside of Minnesota, probably only known, to Kevin's point earlier, as the name of a county or a couple schools in Albert Lea and Northfield and the like. It's interesting that we don't tend as states to remember our first governors the way we remember, for example, George Washington, if we're thinking about the history of America. And so it took me till college, late in college, that I ever learned who Illinois' first governor was, Shadrach Bond. But that's a name that no one's ever heard that name before. We have all of these names of people. There was this era when Minnesota was becoming a state, and oh my gosh, we keep adding counties. We need 87 counties. We got to come up with names. And so many people from that generation got a county named after them, for example.
Sure.
And here we are, and we don't know anything about them. And that.
Well, if I can just add, just interesting, you mentioned Mount Vernon, sorry, just to jump in. The incredible work of the Daughters of the American Revolution to preserve the Sibley House Historic Site, which we operate in partnership with the Dakota County Historical Society, was often framed as Minnesota's Mount Vernon, right? So there are these things that connect to these larger national stories on how Minnesota is reflective of sort of an approach of these iconic places. And over time, that sort of drifted as people, didn't learn a lot about Sibley, and he sort of faded from public memory. And that site still tells that story, but it's a different frame than it was in 1910 when the DAR started it.
Well, and I was also going to come in about Mount Vernon. I just spent 5 weeks there on a research fellowship, and it too is really struggling with how to tell its story. Because you have the Washington story, you also have the Washington owner of or co-owner of 300 enslaved people. And they were really struggling with how to marry those two stories. And I think, in fact, how to keep them together. That it's so tempting to pull one or the other and say, this is the only one. But if we can learn anything from history, it's that most of us are this complicated. That we are these several different people in one person, and in conflict with ourselves. We hold conflicting values. We disagree with ourselves about the values that we hold. And how do I think if we oversimplify those people in the past, we can't also think very well about ourselves. That we then get pulled into that polar way of thinking that I'm either a good person or a bad person. And in fact, what Sibley teaches me is how bad good intentions can be, and how bad desire for respectability can be, and even how much our ambition can alter our values. Right? And that we're each susceptible to this complicating set of factors. And it's not that we're good or bad, but we have to be in constant thought about what we're doing and what its consequences are.
Kate, you were going to add something too?
I would add really quickly, I think that it's important to remember too that idolizing certain individuals and specifically men is a very Western concept. As Indigenous people, we memorialize and honor a lot of people within our history. And you look at this history in particular of when Sibley was driving Dakota people out towards General Sully's army. And during that time where our families were in great fear, That's something that was felt by a lot of people during that time period. And when we think about our families that were leaders in that time period, we don't just think about Little Crow. We don't just think about Medicine Bottle and Shakopee, though we do remember them because they paid such a price. What I remember is that story of my grandmother carrying my grandfather on her back across the river. She's who I idolize during that time period. It's the people whose names we're not going to see on plaques. It's the people who really lived through that time and sacrificed for the children so that we could be here today to share the story.
We do have a couple of questions here, so I'm going to bring up one in our last few minutes, try to get a question or two in. Given that the district is not naming the school after a person, what kind of place names might be appropriate given the proximity of Sibley Historic Site, Fort Snelling, and the confluence of the rivers? And Allicia, I think you actually alluded to it earlier. One idea might, I think this would fit within the parameters, but calling it Bedote High School would actually, it sounds like that would fit within the rules because it's not named after a person. Any thoughts on any additional thoughts here on Kevin's question, Allicia?
Well, when someone mentioned that to me before, I also know that there's Bedote Language Immersion School for the Ojibwe and Dakota languages in Minneapolis. And so I don't know if that would have some conflict of already having a school named that, and that they might also want to continue to be having a high school with the same name. But it's all to be decided. Whatever the community had submitted, we will see. But it won't be after an individual, that we know for sure.
I think it's important also to remember that our language isn't just historic. We continue to name things in Dakota every day, and we can have new names in Dakota. Historically, our people had different names for different places depending on what band you're from. We're always coming up. I mean, it's a living language. We're coming up with new names and new descriptors all the time. And, we have tribal historic preservation officers. We have great educators within our communities that could help put forth a beautiful name as well.
And if I can add, I think that idea of a community naming it is very important. And actually, that is reflective of something, Tom, you said before about counties being named by the legislature and others, right? It was just a very small definition of who the community is. And so I think one of the things we're struggling with is we're bringing in all of these voices that maybe have been relegated to the sidelines in the past. And that's why it becomes such a complex equation. We're all struggling with this idea of identity, of who we are in a community, what our community's identity is. And I use the word complex rather than complicated because I just think there's so many different layers to this. And even the story of Sibley is complicated or complex of depending on who you are. Dr. Beane and I have just very different frames to look at Sibley, and they're both correct. And I think we're struggling as a community, as a society, to have things that are contradictory sort of live in that same space. And that's a really difficult thing for a lot of people.
Let's see if we can do one last question here. I think we had one more we can do before the end of the hour. When students want to have conversations about name changes, how can the adults around them support them? What would the panelists say to the adults out here who might feel the urge to resist or shut down the conversation their students want to have or need? Open mic, whoever wants to throw their voice into that question. How can the adults support them? Kate, I'll call on you.
I think that the most important thing is to listen, and to listen to our young people, to listen to what their needs are, to listen to the way they see the world around them taking shape and the way that they're responding to it. So listening for me is the number one thing. But then also taking into consideration what are their recommendations, remembering to include young people on committees that are making decision making, or that are making the decisions in some of these issues, I think is important.
Allicia, you work at the school with all the young people.
Yeah, I think exactly what Kate's talking about as well. But additionally, for our educators to take that space to listen. I remember hearing somebody on NPR talk about, kids these days probably have a master's degree in cultural diversity and education and microaggressions. And there's teachers who are just starting to catch up because this stuff wasn't taught in school, or things weren't as diverse for where they grew up. And so their sort of second grade knowledge of diversity is not the same as what our students encounter every day. And so listening, being humble to take upon that task to say, this isn't easy. It's not easy to say as a teacher, I don't have all the answers. So sitting back and learning, is really important for our teachers to do that.
We have about a minute left. Annette, were you going to add one
Well,
last note?
That I was going to say that we can also broaden out the conversation to other naming issues. It might be European, Eastern European countries changing names, or more personally, I am of a generation of women who did not want to be called by a married name. That my identity is in my name. And so it's complicated. It seems to me it's helpful if we look at the variety of places where these issues come up to broaden the discussion out. And rather than keeping it so hothouse in one place, it's not a special, precious issue. It's a general issue that many people have to cope with in lots of ways. So to normalize these conversations for kids seems really important.
And they will continue, at least we know they will continue, because if for nothing else, we know, for example, the Minneapolis School District has put together a committee. They're going to be re-examining their school building names. And so these conversations, at least here in the Twin Cities, will absolutely guaranteed continue. We hope that this series has been helpful for people who might be interested in these kinds of conversations where you are, whether or not you're in the Twin Cities. We thank you so much for watching. I want to thank all of our guests here today and for all 4 of our events for being here. And have a great day. And we hope that we have left you with a little something you can use going forward. Thank you.